There's a moment, and I've lived long enough to know this, when the land stops being scenery and becomes a living thing with opinions. When the canyon walls lean in like they're listening. When the silence between two men who don't share a language says more than words ever could. I've watched cattle drives collapse in a single afternoon. I've seen proud men reduced to begging a cloudless sky. But I have never, not once in 41 years of riding this earth, seen anything like what happened at Dry Creek Canyon in the summer of 1874, when a Chiricahua Apache boy carried a dying stranger's water across 12 miles of salt flat, not because anyone asked him to, not because there was anything in it for him, but because of some stubborn, aching, unnameable thing in his chest that wouldn't let him do otherwise. I keep a logbook, always have, mostly for cattle counts and weather patterns, but that summer I wrote something different. I wrote it in small, careful letters like the words might break if I pressed too hard. Some men are tested by fire, others by silence. The hardest test is carrying another man's thirst when your own throat is cracked and bleeding. I'm still not sure I understood what I witnessed. I'm not sure I was meant to. The morning I first saw Nayland, I thought he was a coyote. That probably says something unflattering about my eyesight, or maybe about how the heat off the canyon floor distorts things, bends them, stretches them into shapes that don't belong to any known creature. It was early, barely past first light, and the air already had that mean, copper taste that July brings to that part of Arizona territory. I'd been riding the southern fence line since before dawn because two of Harlan Pruitt's Herefords had pushed through the wire somewhere near the third post. And Harlan Pruitt, being Harlan Pruitt, had sent his frustration across the ranch in the form of a message delivered to my bunkhouse door at 4 in the morning by a 17-year-old Mexican kid named Tomás who looked as miserable as I felt. So there I was, 41 years old, back aching from the saddle, eyes full of grit, riding a gray gelding named Congressman, named that because he was expensive, ate constantly, and produced mostly nothing along the eastern rim of Dry Creek Canyon when I spotted movement below. Not coyote movement, I'd corrected myself by then, lower to the ground, more deliberate. A figure crouched near what remained of the creek bed. Dry Creek Canyon had been dry for 11 weeks. 11 weeks. I know because I'd been counting the way you count things when they matter to your livelihood, when the counting is also a kind of prayer, a kind of bargaining with a sky that isn't listening. 11 weeks since the last real rain. The creek had gone to cracked mud, then to pale dust, then to something like memory, a wide, shallow scar in the canyon floor where water used to flow, where cottonwoods still stood out of pure stubborn habit, their leaves gone silver and small and desperate. The figure crouching near the old creek bed was a boy. I'd say he was 14, maybe 15, hard to know. He was lean in the way that canyon country makes people lean, not skinny from want, but stripped down, efficient, nothing wasted. He wore a simple cotton shirt, pale-colored and dark trousers, moccasins that moved without sound even on the gravel. His hair was long and black and tied back, and he was studying the Dry Creek bed with an intensity I recognized. It was the same look I'd seen on older men studying a poker hand they weren't sure about, reading something in the arrangement of things that wasn't visible to everyone. I pulled Congressman up slow. The horse snorted once, and the boy's head came around instantly, not with fear exactly, more like calibration, like a man adjusting a rifle scope. We looked at each other for a moment. He was maybe 30 feet below me on the canyon slope, half in shadow. I raised my right hand, open palm, felt foolish doing it, wasn't sure what it meant to him. He looked at my hand, looked at my face, looked at Congressman, then back at the creek bed. He went back to his studying, which was either a terrible insult or the most honest thing anyone had done to me in months. I couldn't decide which. I didn't go down that morning. I found Harlan's Herefords about 2 miles east, pushed through a draw by something, probably a mountain cat working the rim at night, and spent 3 hours getting them back through a makeshift repair on the wire that would hold about as long as Harlan's patience, which was to say not long at all. By the time I got back to the main ranch, the sun was directly overhead, and the temperature had reached the kind of number that makes you question your life decisions. The main spread was the double crescent, which sounds grander than it was. Harlan Pruitt had built it 20 years ago on a combination of ambition, borrowed money, and a refusal to accept that this particular piece of Arizona territory was not, in fact, suitable for the kind of cattle operation he'd imagined. He'd made it work anyway, through sheer compulsive stubbornness. But the land had extracted a price. 3 wells gone dry in the past decade, a horse barn fire in 1869, a wife who'd left for Tucson in 1871 with the children and most of the good furniture, and a disposition that had curdled from hopeful to merely enduring. I'd worked for Harlan for 6 years. My name is Theodore Marsh, Teddy to anyone who didn't want a correction, and I'd come to Arizona from Missouri after a failed farming venture and a marriage that ended in the particular kind of silence that's worse than argument. I kept the logbook because my father had kept one, and his father before him, and because writing things down was the only way I knew to keep my own head organized, to separate what had actually happened from what I'd told myself had happened. 2 things which, in my experience, drift apart faster than people expect. Harlan was on the porch when I got back. He was a big man going soft at the edges, with a mustache that he'd grown in his 30s to look authoritative, and which now mostly just looked like something he'd forgotten to remove. "Herefords," he said. "Back in the south pasture," I said. "Wire'll need real repair, not just a patch." He grunted, looked at the sky like it owed him an apology. "Boy came through this morning," he said, still looking up. "Apache boy, young one. Crossed the north pasture like he owned it." I leaned against the porch post. I saw him down in the canyon near the old creek bed. Harlan finally looked at me. What was he doing? "Looking," I said, "just looking." Harlan made a sound that meant nothing in particular, which was his way of expressing several complicated feelings at once. The reservation boundary was 12 miles south. The Chiricahua had been pushed back there in fits and starts over the past decade, but individuals moved, especially young ones, especially in times of drought when the reservation's own water sources were strained. The Army had opinions about this. So did most of the white settlers in the territory. Harlan's opinions were, like most of his opinions, practical rather than ideological. He didn't want trouble, and he didn't want witnesses to anything that might become trouble. "You run him off?" Harlan asked. "No," I said. Another grunt, probably wise. I went back to the canyon the next morning. Earlier this time, before light, before the heat set in, riding out under a sky still thick with stars, and that particular pre-dawn quiet that's the only quiet I've ever truly trusted. He was already there. Same boy, same spot, same posture, crouched at the edge of the old creek bed, but doing something different today. He had a stick, a long, narrow piece of cottonwood, and he was probing the ground with it. Methodical. 6 inches, pull up, move left, probe again. Then stop, press his palm flat against the earth, hold still, lift his hand and examine the moisture or lack of it on his skin. He was searching for subsurface water. I knew this because I'd seen it done before. An old Tohono O'odham man had shown a version of it to me years ago. The technique of reading the ground not by what's visible, but by what the earth is holding below, where the capillary moisture hasn't yet evaporated, where you might dig down 18 inches and find something that would keep you alive another day. But Nayland wasn't doing it for himself. That was the thing I understood only gradually, watching him work his way along the old creek bed with his stick and his patience and his quiet, methodical attention to each square foot of ground. Because about 40 feet behind him, propped against the canyon wall in the thin shade of a cottonwood that was barely alive itself, was a man. A white man, older than me, maybe 60. He wore a cavalry jacket from which the insignia had been partially removed, army trousers, boots that were falling apart. His face was red and deeply weathered and currently the color of old clay, which is a color that means something specific when you've spent time in the desert. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't far from it. His head was tilted back against the rock, his mouth slightly open, his eyes half closed and unfocused. The boy had a canteen, small one. I could see the water line when he picked it up, nearly empty. He walked back to the man, crouched beside him, said something in a low voice. The man didn't respond. The boy tilted the canteen, put it to the man's lips, gave him maybe 3 swallows, then pulled it away, recapped it, walked back to the creek bed. He went back to probing. I watched for a long time. Long enough that the sky lightened and the stars faded and the canyon walls went from black to gray to that particular red-orange, that the Arizona stone shows in early morning like it's trying to prove something. The boy never looked at me. He knew I was there, I was certain of that, certain in the way you get certain about people who are paying close attention to their entire environment even when they appear to be focused on one thing. He knew, and he didn't stop. I had a full canteen. 2, actually. I always carried 2 in July. I'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago, one bad afternoon south of Tucson that I still don't like to think about. I had water, and there was a man against the canyon wall who was going to die if he didn't get more than what was left in that small tin container. So I made the obvious decision and did the obvious thing. I rode down into the canyon. The boy looked up when I reached the floor, not startled, just the same calibrating look, taking inventory of the situation, adjusting. I held up the canteens, said nothing. He looked at them, looked at my face, looked at the man against the wall. He nodded once, barely perceptible, but a nod. I dismounted, tied Congressman to the most alive-looking cottonwood, and walked to where the man was sitting. Up close, he was in worse shape than I'd thought. His lips were cracked and bleeding in several places. His hands, resting in his lap, showed the early signs of deep dehydration, skin losing its elasticity, that papery look. His breathing was shallow but regular. I opened the canteen and tilted water into him slowly. Not too fast, you can hurt a man that way if they're far enough gone, flooding too much too fast into a system that's been running on empty. I gave him small sips, waited, more small sips, waited again. After a while his eyes focused. He looked at me with the clarity that comes just before and just after crisis. That bare, unmediated look people have when there's nothing left to perform. "Much obliged," he said. His voice was a ruin, rough and thin. "Don't talk," I said. He nodded and closed his eyes. I looked over at the boy, who had come closer now and was watching with the same measured attention he'd given the creek bed. I wondered what he was reading in this. An old white man in a former Army jacket, being kept alive by a canteen the Apache boy had clearly rationed for him at his own expense. There was a story before this one that I didn't know. Several stories, probably. "He yours?" I asked, foolish question. The boy shook his head, slight and definitive. "Found," he said. It was the only English word he offered all morning, and it was enough. Found, he'd found this man the way you find a thing you weren't looking for, and then apparently made the decision, without much deliberation, or maybe with more than I could imagine, to stay. That was the moment I stopped being simply curious about this boy. I started being something closer to afraid of him. Not fear of danger. Fear of what it means when someone shows you something about human nature that you weren't prepared to see, something that adjusts the way the world looks from the inside. I pulled out my logbook. I wrote one line, there in the canyon shade, with the old man breathing slowly beside me and the boy watching the page like he understood what I was doing even if not the words. July 14, 1874. Dry Creek Canyon, a boy who owes nothing, staying anyway. His name I learned later, from one of the older Apache men who sometimes came to trade at the settlement store near the reservation boundary. Nayland. The word was explained to me in halting English mixed with gestures as meaning something like one who moves carefully or, more loosely, the patient one. I wrote it down wrong the first time and had to cross it out. He had been alone in the canyon for 2 days before I found them. He'd come north following game tracks and found the old man, who turned out to be a former Army surveyor named Elias Creed, retired or discharged. It was never entirely clear, on the canyon floor in the full sun with no horse, no real supplies, and a canteen that was already half empty. Why he'd stayed, I couldn't fully reconstruct. The language barrier made a complete explanation impossible, and even with the partial translation I got later, there was something at the center of Nayland's decision that resisted being explained in anyone's words. He'd stayed. He'd rationed his own water to keep a stranger alive. He'd been searching the dry creek bed for more because he needed it, not for himself or not primarily for himself, but because what he had wasn't going to be enough. That was the shape of it, the bones of what happened. The flesh of it, the weight of it, the specific human gravity that was still coming. I brought more water that afternoon, and the morning after. Elias Creed couldn't be moved yet, not safely. He was recovering but fragile, the desert having done more internal damage than was obvious from outside. I rigged a shade with spare canvas from my saddlebag, propped on cottonwood branches Nayland and I cut together without speaking, coordinating through glance and gesture with an efficiency that surprised me. He was good with his hands, quick and sure-footed. On the second afternoon, while Elias slept, Nayland and I sat in the canyon shade and he showed me something. He took 3 pebbles, smooth ones from the dry creek bed, and arranged them in a rough triangle on the ground between us. Then he drew a line in the dust with his finger connecting them. Then he placed a fourth pebble some distance away and drew another line connecting it to only one corner of the triangle. I looked at the arrangement, looked at him. He pointed to the isolated pebble, then to himself. Then he pointed to the triangle. He didn't say anything. He let it sit there, the geometry of his situation laid out in stones and dust, and looked at me with those level, measuring eyes, and waited to see what I'd do with it. I knew what the triangle was, the reservation, the 3 points of something enclosed, bounded, and the single pebble off to the side, connected by a line that went one direction but not both. I sat with it for a while. Then I picked up a pebble of my own and placed it near his isolated stone. He looked at it, looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, not gratitude. Something more complicated than either, the look of a person who has been correctly understood in a language that has no words. I wrote it in the logbook later. 2 pebbles side by side, a bit apart from the shape of things. It wasn't much, but in that canyon, in that heat, with that old man breathing shallow in the shade behind us, it felt like a kind of agreement. On the 3rd morning, something changed. I came down into the canyon to find Nayland gone. The canvas shade still stood. Elias Creed was awake, more awake than he'd been, sitting up with more control in his face, and he held his small canteen in both hands with the careful reverence of a man who'd had a recent education in what water actually means. "Where is he?" I asked. Elias looked toward the canyon's northern end. "Left before light," he said. "Woke me up, said something, I don't know what." He paused, turned the canteen in his hands. "Left this," he said. "Full, he filled it somehow." He looked at me with old, tired eyes. "Don't know where he got it." The ground near the creek bed. I walked over, dug down with my boot heel. The soil was damp 6 inches down. He'd found it. Sometime in the night, working by whatever light there was, he dug down in the right spot and found the subsurface seep, that thin capillary moisture the canyon held below its dry face. He'd filled the canteen and left. And then he'd gone. I stood there in the early morning light with my boot heel in the damp earth and felt something that I have thought about many times since and never been able to name precisely. It wasn't simple admiration. It wasn't quite grief. It was something between, a feeling like watching a door close that you hadn't known was open. I pulled out the logbook. Wrote nothing for a long time. Then wrote he solved the problem and left. No performance, no waiting to be thanked. Then crossed it out, then wrote it again in smaller letters. Elias Creed would recover fully. He made it back to the settlement after 4 days, with my help and Harlan's grudging loan of the buckboard. He never talked much about what had happened to him. Men of his generation and experience had a practiced way of not talking about things that had restructured their understanding of the world. But Nayland was already gone. Back south, back toward the reservation boundary, back to wherever the triangle of his life was drawn. He'd come north following game tracks, found a dying stranger, stayed for 3 days, solved the problem, and left. I went back to Dry Creek Canyon once more that summer, alone. I sat on the canyon floor near the spot where he'd dug, where the damp earth had already dried again in the July heat, smooth and pale and giving nothing away. The cottonwoods were still standing, still trying. The thermometer at the Double Crescent Ranch had been reading 109 at midday for so many consecutive days that Harlan had stopped looking at it, which was either an act of wisdom or denial. And with Harlan Prout, those 2 things had always occupied approximately the same territory. I had not stopped thinking about Nayland. That's not precisely accurate because I kept up with my work, the fences, the cattle, the daily logbook entries about water levels and pasture conditions, and the increasingly grim arithmetic of a summer that was trying to bankrupt us. But underneath all of it, the boy was there. The shape of him. The way he'd arranged those pebbles. The quiet economy of everything he did, nothing wasted, nothing performed. I'd asked around, carefully, in the way you have to ask in those years about things involving Apache individuals and their movements. Too direct a question, and you get wrong answers on purpose, or looks that make you feel like the question itself was a kind of violence. But I had a few conversations with the trader near the boundary, with an army sergeant I'd known in a previous part of my life who was stationed at the fort outside town, and who was unusual in that he'd developed actual relationships with people on the reservation, rather than simply a tactical understanding of them. His name was Craddock, Eli Craddock. He found me at the settlement store in early August, which meant he'd been looking, which meant something had happened. "Your boy," he said, when we were somewhere private enough. He said it like I'd declared ownership, which I hadn't, but I understood what he meant. "He's not my anything," I said. "What happened?" Craddock turned his hat in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was uncomfortable, rotating the brim slowly, like he was winding something up. "He's back on the reservation, but there's been a dispute about water." I waited. There's a spring on the northwest end of the reservation, only spring that's still got good pressure this summer. The headman of Nalen's band has been controlling access to it, rationing it out. He paused. "There's another family, smaller group, related by marriage somewhere back, but there was a falling out couple years before I arrived. The headman cut them off from the spring." "For what reason?" Craddock rotated the hat brim. "Reasons that seem large to people who have them, not large enough to explain from the outside." He looked at me. "The boy has been bringing them water." I kept my face still. "From the spring," he continued. "At night, without the headman knowing, or at least without being caught. He's been doing it for 3 weeks." I thought about this for 2 days. I wrote about it in the logbook, several entries, working through what I knew and what I didn't and what, if anything, I should do about it. The answer that kept coming up was, nothing. It wasn't my situation. It wasn't my community or my authority or my standing to do anything. Any interference from outside, especially from a white rancher, especially with anything adjacent to reservation politics, would cause more harm than it solved. I knew this. I wrote it down clearly. Do not interfere, not your place. And then on the 3rd day, a girl came to the ranch. She was young, 12, maybe 13, and she arrived at the ranch gate in the mid-morning heat on foot, which meant she'd walked at least from the reservation boundary, probably further, and the walk had cost her something. She was dehydrated in a minor but visible way. She stood at the gate without opening it, looking at the house, and I happened to be passing from the stable, and I stopped. We looked at each other. She said something, not English, but she pointed south toward the reservation, and then made a gesture I couldn't fully interpret, but that involved her hands moving in a rapid, worried pattern. I gave her water first, sat her down in the shade of the gate post, and gave her the canteen from my saddle and waited while she drank. She drank in that same careful, unhurried way Nalen had, not gulping, rationing even in relief. I waited. She tried again, a different word said slowly, and then, "Nalen," and then the gesture again. The worried hands. Craddock, when I reached him, didn't look surprised to see me. "I heard," he said, which was his way of saying he'd been waiting for me to come. "The girl, his sister, probably. What's happened?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that means the answer is bad. "He got caught last night, taking water from the spring." He kept his eyes on me, steady and careful. "The headman it's complicated. In that community, that kind of thing is." He stopped, started again. "It's not a small violation. It challenges the authority of the man who makes decisions for the group, and you do not do that without consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "He's being held. There'll be a—" he searched for the word. "A hearing, a decision. His family's been effectively," he rotated the hat brim. "Excluded, further excluded." I stood still for a moment. "Can anything be done from outside?" "You mean, can I do anything?" "Yes." He was quiet again. "I'd make it worse. Army involvement in internal reservation matters." He shook his head. "It signals things, bad things. The people I know there trust me because I stay out." I looked at him. He looked back, but there's a man. His name is Tohono. He's an elder, different band, but he has standing. Relationships with Nalen's headman that go back a long time. If someone were to carry a message to him, and if that someone were to do it in a way that didn't look official, didn't look like army, didn't look like outside interference. He let it sit there. I picked it up. Riding south in the afternoon heat is a choice that every rational part of your brain argues against. The sun is directly hostile. The land offers no mercy. You sweat out more than you can comfortably replace, even with 2 full canteens, and Congressman, who had limited patience for discomfort, expressed his opinion about the situation in a continuous series of small theatrical protests, pulling at the reins, snorting, slowing at every shadow. I'd gotten basic directions from Craddock and more specific ones from the girl, who had remained at the ranch. Harlan had offered this with a gruffness that was his version of kindness, and was now sitting in the bunkhouse shade with a plate of food that Tamaz had produced from somewhere. The landscape south of the boundary was different from Harlan's land. Less managed, less shaped by human intention, but not wild in a simple way. More like a landscape that had its own organization that I wasn't qualified to read. The vegetation changed in subtle ways, the rock formations took on different angles, and the heat seemed to bend in a different direction, less pressing down, more radiating up from the ground. I found the elders' camp in late afternoon, which was partly luck and partly the girls' directions being better than I'd expected. Tohono was a small man, older than the desert, sitting in the shade of a brush shelter with a cup of something in his hands, looking at me coming across the flat with an expression of complete unsurprise. As if he'd been expecting exactly this, a sweating, uncertain white man on a reluctant gray horse arriving with trouble in his eyes. I got down, Tide Congressman stood. He gestured toward the shade. I sat. He didn't speak first. That was a thing I'd learned the hard way about conversations with certain people, that the first move belongs to the person who has the need, and rushing the ritual of it is a kind of disrespect. So I sat in his shade for what might have been 3 minutes or 10, timed as something strange in that kind of heat. And then I told him what I knew, as simply and directly as I could. He listened, his expression didn't change much, but his eyes tracked everything carefully. When I finished, he said something I didn't understand. Then he said in careful, accented English that was better than he'd initially let on, "Why does this concern you?" I thought about that. Because a month ago, I said slowly, I watched this boy keep a stranger alive, a man he didn't know who didn't look like him, who didn't speak his language, who had no particular claim on him. He stayed anyway. He solved the problem and left without any ceremony about it. I stopped. I don't know why I came. I couldn't explain it in a way that satisfies me, but I couldn't not come. Tohono looked at me for a long moment, drank from his cup. The boy is stubborn, he said finally. Yes, I said. Something shifted in the old man's expression. This is not always comfortable, he said. Stubbornness, he looked at the horizon, but it is sometimes correct. He set his cup down. I will speak with Mosi, he said. The headman, I have spoken with him before on harder matters than this. He paused. There will be conditions. The boy will need to make a recognition of the authority he challenged. This is necessary, you understand. Yes, I said. He looked at me again with those old, specific eyes. And you cannot be part of what happens after you leave this place. Whatever is decided, it will be decided by us. Your name will not be in it. I understand, I said. He nodded once, picked up his cup. I took that as a dismissal and stood. Untied Congressman got ready to mount. The stranger, Tohono said from behind me. The man the boy stayed with, he lived. He did, I said. Good, the old man said simply. That means the water was not wasted. I rode back north through the cooling evening, and somewhere in the middle of that ride, with the stars beginning and the desert going purple and still, I had to stop. Just stop. I got down from Congressman. He accepted this with dignified relief, and I sat on a rock at the edge of the flats and I took out the logbook. I didn't write for a while, just held it. Then I wrote he didn't carry that water because it would be recognized. He carried it because someone was going to die otherwise. The consequence he's now facing is the same logic applied inward. He knew what it would cost, and he did it anyway. I crossed that out too. The desert doesn't need you to narrate it. I put the logbook away and rode home. Nayland was released 3 days later. Craddock got word to me through his usual channels, adding only that there had been a formal process, a recognition, and that the family from which water had been withheld had been quietly included in the spring access again. Tohono's name was mentioned. Mine wasn't. I went to the settlement store the following week, and when I came out, there was a small object on Congressman's saddle. A pebble smooth from a creek bed, with a mark on it, a line scratched into the surface. I held it for a while, then put it in my pocket, then that evening put it in the logbook between 2 pages where it stayed. I didn't know if Nayland had left it or if it was coincidence. I told myself it was probably coincidence. I told myself that a number of times. The stone was still warm from the sun. October came and brought exactly what October in that part of Arizona usually brought, the first suggestions of mercy. The temperature dropped by degrees that felt like gifts. The sky changed character, and then on the 14th of October it rained. Not a dramatic rain, not the kind you write poems about. A slow, gray, persistent rain that came in from the southwest and settled in for 2 days, soaking the earth with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and was in no hurry now that it had arrived. I stood on the porch of the double crescent and watched it for a long while. Harlan stood beside me. Neither of us said anything for a good 15 minutes. "Creek might run again," Harlan finally said. "Might," I agreed. He grunted, went inside. I stayed on the porch until dark, watching the rain come down, listening to the sound it made on the dry earth when it landed, a specific sound, a hiss and a whisper, something between relief and accusation. I went to Dry Creek Canyon 3 days after the rain. Not for any work reason. I told myself it was to check the condition of the fence line along the eastern rim, which was true but incomplete. The real reason was the creek. I wanted to see if it was running. It was, barely, a thin, tentative ribbon of water moving over the cracked clay floor of the canyon, brown and cloudy, and moving with the hesitancy of something that wasn't sure of its welcome. But running. I got down from Congressman and went to the edge and crouched and put my hand in it. The water was cold, moved around my fingers with something that felt like intention. I heard movement behind me. I stood and turned. Nayland was there. He was standing at the canyon's edge, maybe 20 feet away, looking at the creek. Not at me, at the water. He had the same posture I remembered, that economic stillness, but something in him was different in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Less cautious, maybe, or the same level of caution but pointed in a different direction. He looked older too, but it was only 3 months, so that wasn't possible. What I was actually seeing was something that had happened to his face in those 3 months. Some arrangement of experience that sits just under the surface of a person's skin and changes the way light catches them. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that from him. He came down the slope to the canyon floor and stood near the water. Bent, touched it, held his hand in the thin stream for a moment. Then he looked at me. He reached into a small bag he carried, something I hadn't noticed before, and took out a folded piece of paper, held it toward me. I took it, opened it carefully because it had been folded and refolded many times. It was a page, covered in marks, some of which were clearly an attempt at English letters, imperfect, the letters formed by someone who had taught themselves or been taught unevenly. And interspersed with the letters were other marks, symbols I didn't recognize in any script I knew. I looked at it for a long time. I could pick out a few things. What looked like an attempt at my name, Teddy, the letters right but the spelling phonetic, and a word that might have been water and one that might have been spring. The rest I couldn't read. The rest was his, in a language I didn't have. He watched me looking at it. I looked up. He made a gesture, the same one his sister had made, the worried hands gesture. But slower now, and I understood it better this time, or thought I did. It was something like "this is complicated," or maybe I don't have the words, or maybe it was neither of those things, and I was projecting onto his hands the meaning I needed. I took out my logbook. I turned it to show him. He studied it. Something flickered in his expression, recognition. He could read it, at least partially. He pointed to the letters, then to himself, then nodded once. I wrote good. He almost smiled. I want to be precise about this. His expression moved a small distance toward something that in any other face would have resolved into a smile, but in his settled somewhere just before that, a controlled warmth contained. We sat by the creek for a while. The afternoon light was that late October gold that Arizona does better than anywhere, a light that seems to come from inside things rather than from above, and the canyon held it beautifully, the red walls deepening into amber and rust. He had a strip of dried meat that he took from his bag and broke in half and handed one piece to me. I took it without ceremony. It was good, spiced with something I didn't recognize, the texture dense and satisfying. We ate by the running creek. After a while he spoke, not in English. He spoke in his own language, a long sentence or maybe several sentences, at a pace that was clearly not meant for translation. clearly not performed for my benefit but addressed to something larger. The canyon, maybe, or the water, or the particular quality of light on the October afternoon. I listened to the sound of it, the rhythm, the way it moved. When he stopped, I said nothing. He looked at the creek. Then he reached into his bag again and produced another pebble, larger than the one on my saddle, with 2 lines scratched on it rather than 1. He set it on the ground between us. I looked at it. 2 lines, not one direction but 2. Not the single connection he'd drawn in the dust 3 months ago, but something bilateral, mutual, going both ways. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the logbook and turned to the middle, where the first pebble was still sitting between the pages. I took it out and set it beside his new one on the ground. He looked at the 2 stones. Looked at me. The controlled warmth moved slightly further in his expression, and then, finally, briefly resolved. I have thought about what happened next many times, and I want to be careful about how I write it, because the logbook is a place where I try to tell the truth about things as they actually happened, not as I would prefer to have them be. What happened was this. Nayland looked at the 2 stones on the ground between us. Then he looked at me with an expression that was not simple, that held several things at once. Something that was maybe gratitude, and something that was maybe assessment, and something that was not either of those. Something I still don't have the right word for. He looked at me for a long time with that complex expression. Then he stood, picked up his stone, not mine, his. He held it for a moment, then put it back in his bag. I understood, I think. The stone was not a gift, it was a message. The message was not mine to keep, it was his to carry. Whatever the marks meant, whatever that doubled line represented, it was his statement about something, and he was taking it back because it had been received. He picked up the smaller stone, the one from my logbook, from the ground between us, held it out. I took it back, put it in my pocket. He nodded, picked up his bag, and looked at the creek one more time. The thin, uncertain water moving in the canyon floor, brown and cold and trying its best. Then he walked north along the canyon. He didn't look back. He moved the way he always moved, with that careful, efficient economy that left no trace of effort. I watched him until he was out of sight. I sat by the creek for a long time after. The light changed, moved through amber into that thin, steel-blue quality that comes just before evening in October. The creek ran without urgency. The cottonwood leaves, the ones that remained, had gone yellow, and they moved in the first slight evening breeze with a dry, papery sound that was almost like speech. I took out the logbook, turned to a fresh page, sat with the pen for a while. Elias Creed was alive, and from what I'd heard, had returned to surveying work somewhere east of Tucson, having apparently made no permanent narrative out of what had happened to him in the canyon. Men like Elias were good at that, at absorbing extraordinary things into the general texture of their lives without allowing any one event to become the thing that defined the story. I had never been especially good at that. The logbook had 46 years of evidence against it. I wrote about the creek first. Water depth, color, estimated flow rate, the practical information. Then I wrote about the cottonwoods and their color and the way the light was doing its particular October thing on the canyon walls. Then I stopped performing the habit of recording and wrote what I actually meant. He came back, I don't know why. Maybe the creek, maybe coincidence. Maybe he wanted to see if the water had returned, same reason I came. Maybe there's no greater meaning in the coincidence than that 2 people can arrive at the same place from different directions at the same moment and find each other there. But I don't think it was coincidence. I think he knew, the way he always seems to know things by some mechanism I can't map, that this was the day the canyon needed someone to witness the water coming back. And maybe he knew that I'd come for the same reason. 2 pebbles, 2 lines. I held the smaller stone in my left hand while I wrote. The one he'd returned to me. It was warm from my pocket, smooth from the creek bed, ordinary in every physical way. I put it back in the logbook. Harlan asked me at dinner that evening, where I'd been all afternoon. Canyon, I said. The creek running. Running, I said. He nodded, looked at his plate. Something in his face shifted, some slight relaxation of the chronic tension he carried in his jaw and around his eyes. Good, he said, just that. We ate in silence. which was our ordinary kind of conversation, and it was fine. The ranch had 17 more years of life in it. I know that now, though I didn't know it then. Harlan would eventually sell, not in defeat exactly, but in the particular kind of exhaustion that arrives when you've proven a point long enough that the proving itself becomes the thing you're tired of. I'd stay through all of it. I'd fill 11 more logbooks in that house and on that land. But I never went back to Dry Creek Canyon. Some places you only get to see clearly once. Going back is a different activity than returning. One is about the place, the other is about yourself. And by the time I understood the difference, I also understood that the canyon had already given me what it had. The last entry I made that October, I wrote by lamplight back in the bunkhouse, with the small pebble sitting on the table beside the open book. He didn't explain himself. That is the thing I keep coming back to. No speech about duty or compassion or the right thing to do. He found a stranger dying and stayed. He found his neighbors being denied water and brought it to them. He carried a message I couldn't even read in full to the edge of a creek that was learning how to run again. If there's a lesson in it, he never offered one, and that may be the lesson. I blew out the lamp. The bunkhouse was dark except for the stars coming through the single window, the particular Arizona stars that seem closer in October, as if the sky itself is making an effort. I don't know what happened to him after. I heard things, second and third hand in the years that followed, a name that might have been his, in contexts I couldn't verify, connected to events I'm uncertain how to interpret. What I know is what I saw. A boy in a dry canyon, a stranger he'd never met. 3 days of water rationed with the care of something precious and given without ceremony.